Hello everyone, and welcome back to Farmyard Care. Let me start with a scene many of you know well. It is a cool Saturday morning. You walk out to the coop with a basket in your hand, already thinking about the fresh eggs you are about to collect. But when you open the nesting boxes, they are nearly empty. The hens look tired, the coop smells sharp and dirty, and instead of that rewarding feeling you hoped for, all you feel is frustration. Then you think about the money. Bag after bag of feed, extra supplements, bedding, small treatments, constant upkeep, and somehow the costs keep rising while the eggs do not. Now, if you keep chickens in the backyard, grow a few vegetables, care about good soil, and want healthier food for your family without wasting time and money, then this is personal. Because the truth is, most people did not start raising chickens to become dependent on expensive inputs every month. You wanted fresh eggs, hardy birds, a cleaner system, and a setup that actually works with nature, not against it. So let me ask you something. Are we truly raising chickens, or have we just become caretakers of an exhausting system that keeps demanding more and giving less back? Why does it feel like we spend more time buying feed, cleaning waste, and solving problems than actually enjoying the flock? Here is the surprising part. Farmers in Japan figured out a different way generations ago. In traditional natural farming systems, they built a closed-loop method where chickens could stay productive with little to no reliance on commercial feed. These birds were not barely surviving. They stayed active, healthy, and productive far longer than many modern backyard flocks do today. And when you look at the eggs, you can see the difference immediately. Rich, deep orange yolks, strong, vibrant color, the kind of egg that tells you the bird was truly nourished. Today, we are going to break this system down step by step and look at how Japanese farmers spend nothing on chicken feed and still get far more out of their flock than most people expect. So subscribe to Farmyard Care and let's get into it. Part 1. The illusion of modern poultry farming. Let's begin with an uncomfortable truth. Most people are raising chickens the hard way because they were taught to think about chickens the wrong way. Month after month, you drive to the feed store and load up on pellets, layer ration, scratch grain, calcium, grit, and oyster shell. Then you spend your weekends scraping manure, changing bedding, dealing with mites, and trying to stay ahead of coughing, stress, and sickness in the coop. It becomes a routine of buying, cleaning, replacing, and repeating. And the question is, why does it feel this difficult? Because modern poultry systems trained us to treat chickens like isolated production units instead of living animals inside a living system. We keep them in bare runs, limited spaces, and lifeless setups where boredom turns into stress and stress turns into weakness. Then we wonder why the flock needs more inputs every season just to stay productive. That is monoculture thinking brought into the backyard. Instead of building a system that supports the birds naturally, we keep forcing birds to live in a system that creates one problem after another. If you really stop and look at it, the pattern becomes obvious. Poor design creates the weakness, and then the industry sells you the fix. You buy the feed, then the supplements, then the bedding, then the treatments. But what if the birds are not the real problem? What if the design is what keeps failing? That is where this story really starts. To understand how different this can be, we need to go back to a time when people could not afford waste, and survival depended on building a system that actually worked. The roots of survival, a post-war miracle. The year was 1947. In the years following the war, Japan was facing one of the harshest food shortages in its modern history. Agricultural inspectors studying small poultry operations near Osaka expected to find collapse, because by every conventional standard, that is what should have happened. Grain was too valuable to feed to animals. Feed mills were shut down. National production had fallen hard, and every available resource had to be stretched for human survival first. But what they found did not fit Western expectations at all. They found small household flocks consuming no purchased commercial grain, yet still producing at remarkably high levels. Hens were laying around 280 eggs a year, outperforming many commercial averages of that same era. On paper, it made no sense. In practice, it made perfect biological sense. These households were not relying on supply chains. They were relying on observation, local materials, and the ability to turn waste into nutrition. Kitchen scraps, spoiled greens, vegetable trimmings, and rice bran were no longer seen as leftovers. They became feed resources. These farmers were not trying to maximize profit margins or chase industrial efficiency. They were trying to survive with what they had, and that pressure forced them to create a system that was lean, practical, and incredibly effective. What emerged from that period was more than a survival trick. It was a complete model of resilience. They built a way of raising chickens that modern systems still struggle to match when you measure true cost per egg. And the reason this knowledge faded from the mainstream is simple. A system that runs on biology, waste recovery, and good design is hard to package and sell. But that forgotten logic is exactly what makes it so powerful. And in the next part, we get to the biological engine that made it all possible. Part 3, the secret ingredient. Fermented feed, the power of microbes. At the center of this Japanese low-cost feeding system, there is no miracle crop and no special chicken breed. The real secret is a biological process, and that process is fermentation. In natural farming, waste is never treated like waste if it can still serve a purpose. Farmers take kitchen scraps, combine them with rice bran, add water, and let that mixture sit sealed for several days. What looks simple on the outside is actually a very powerful transformation happening inside the bucket. Once the environment turns low in oxygen, beneficial bacteria begin to multiply fast. Lactobacillus, which is naturally present on grains and vegetables, starts feeding on sugars and producing lactic acid. As the acidity rises, the pH drops low enough to create an environment that harmful microbes do not like, while beneficial organisms continue to thrive. In other words, the feed becomes safer, more stable, and far more useful to the bird. But the real advantage goes even deeper. Rice bran contains valuable protein and B vitamins, yet some of those nutrients are tied up by phytic acid, which makes them harder for chickens to use. Fermentation helps break that barrier down. The food is partially pre-digested before the hen even eats it, and minerals like calcium, phosphorus, iron, and zinc become much more available. That changes everything. When feed is easier to digest and nutrients are easier to absorb, birds do not need to eat as much volume to get what they need. They pull more value from every mouthful. So what you are really doing is taking household leftovers and turning them into a dense, probiotic-rich feed source that supports the flock for almost no cost at all. And once you understand that principle, the next piece of the system starts to make perfect sense. Part 4, the living bioreactor. Deep litter coops. If feed is one half of the equation, the coop is the other. Because once you stop wasting nutrition, the next step is to stop wasting manure, labor, and energy. And this is where many backyard keepers are still working against nature without realizing it. In Korean and Japanese natural farming systems, the coop is not treated like a sterile box that must be constantly stripped and scrubbed. It is treated like a living biological space. The floor begins with earth, then a deep layer of litter such as straw, carbon-rich material, and soil. But the real difference is that this bedding is not left biologically empty. It is inoculated with beneficial microbes. Farmers apply diluted lactic acid bacteria and indigenous microorganisms to the litter so microbial life can establish itself quickly. From that moment on, the bedding starts working like a living reactor. As manure drops, the microbes begin breaking it down right away. That is why these systems can stay far drier, far less offensive, and far more balanced than a typical coop where waste simply piles up until the owner removes it. And the benefits keep stacking. As decomposition and fermentation continue under the birds, The litter can generate gentle, natural warmth, which helps the flock through colder weather. Smell drops. Flies are reduced. Moisture becomes easier to manage. Disease pressure can go down because waste is being processed instead of rotting in place. Best of all, you are no longer trapped in a cycle of constant cleaning. In well-managed natural systems, that bedding can remain in place for years, with only small amounts removed from time to time and used as rich garden fertilizer. So the coop stops being a place of endless maintenance and becomes part of the fertility engine of the whole property. And once the chickens are living in a system like that, the next question becomes obvious. If they can feed the soil, how else can they work for the farm? 5. Chickens as ecological workers, rotational foraging. And once you begin seeing the coop as part of a living system, it becomes impossible to ignore one of the most important ideas in Japanese natural farming. We cannot have this conversation without mentioning Masanobu Fukuoka, the farmer and thinker behind the one-straw revolution. Fukuoka spoke about what many people call do-nothing farming, but that phrase is often misunderstood. He was never talking about neglect. He was talking about removing unnecessary intervention, watching nature closely, and letting each part of the system do the work it was already designed to do. That includes the chickens. Fukuoka understood that a chicken is not just a bird that lays eggs. A chicken is also a worker in the landscape. It clears, scratches, hunts, fertilizes, and converts what would otherwise be waste into value. So instead of carrying feed to the birds all the time, Japanese farmers often bring the birds to the feed. After a bed is harvested or after a field is cleared, the chickens are moved in. For a week or two, they do what chickens naturally do best. They scratch through the soil surface, dig out hidden insect larvae, pick off overwintering pests, eat drop vegetables, and consume weed seeds before those seeds ever get the chance to sprout. While they are doing that, they are also loosening the top layer of soil with their feet and adding manure exactly where fertility is needed next. That means your chickens are not only helping feed themselves, they are also reducing pest pressure, lowering weed pressure, and speeding up the cycling of organic matter back into the ground. This is where the system becomes truly elegant. The flock stops being a separate chore you manage off to the side and starts becoming part of how the garden renews itself. They become your insect patrol, your cleanup crew, your light tillers, and your mobile fertility team. And once you understand that, the next step becomes obvious. If chickens can harvest from the land, then the smartest thing you can do is grow more of that harvest right around them. Part 6. Growing your own chicken feed, insect-attracting plants. If you really want to reduce dependence on the feed store, you cannot stop at the bucket. You have to look at the ground itself. Because in the best Japanese systems, the landscape is designed to produce food for the flock long before you ever open a bag of feed. Around the coop and throughout the garden edges, farmers plant crops that do more than just grow. They attract life. Comfrey, amaranth, sunflowers, and buckwheat are especially useful because they pull insects into the system while also producing leaves, seeds, biomass, and shade. In other words, they do several jobs at once. These plants act like living magnets for aphids, beetles, caterpillars, grasshoppers, and other small creatures that chickens are eager to hunt. The birds move through these areas every day, searching the stems, leaves, and soil surface for fresh protein. That gives them a renewable food source that is active, local, and built directly into the design of the space. But the value does not stop with insects. Comfrey gives you mineral-rich leaves that can be cut and fed fresh. Sunflowers and amaranth produce a heavy supply of seed that can support the flock later in the season, especially when natural forage begins to decline. And when those plants finish their cycle, they do not become waste. You can cut them down and leave them as mulch, helping the soil hold moisture, protect surface life, and build fertility for the next round of growth. That is the beauty of this approach. One planting creates food for insects, food for chickens, and organic matter for the soil, all at the same time. A cheap packet of seeds can keep paying you back again and again through stronger forage, better fertility, and lower feed costs. And when you combine that with fermented feed, living litter, and rotational foraging, you begin to see why these flocks can produce so much more than people expect. Part 7. The 3 times more eggs phenomenon in deep orange yolks. So after all of this, what do you actually get from fermented feed, living litter, rotational foraging, and a landscape built to support the flock? You get the result every chicken keeper cares about most. You get the eggs. And this is where the difference becomes impossible to ignore. A typical backyard hen raised mainly on commercial pellets may give you a decent run for a season or two, but many birds slow down quickly, especially once winter stress and nutritional imbalance start to catch up with them. In these integrated Japanese systems, the birds often stay productive much longer because the whole environment is working in their favor. They are not just being fed, they are being supported from every direction through better digestion, better movement, better forage, lower stress, and healthier living conditions. That is why the output can be so dramatic. You are not looking at a small improvement. You are looking at a completely different level of long-term productivity. More eggs each year and far more useful years from the same hen. When a bird stays strong for 3 or 4 productive seasons instead of burning out early, the lifetime return changes completely. But the story does not end with quantity. In many ways, the more important difference is quality. Crack open an egg from a naturally foraging hen, and you can see it right away. The yolk is darker, richer, firmer, and more vibrant. That deep orange color is not there for looks. It reflects a diet filled with living greens, insects, and natural pigments that simply do not show up the same way in a flock raised on a narrow commercial ration alone. And that color points to something deeper: nutrition. Eggs from birds raised in diverse outdoor systems are often richer in the very compounds people want most, including omega-3s, vitamin E, beta-carotene, and fat-soluble vitamins that matter for real health. This is not just a prettier egg for the breakfast table. It is a more complete food. That is why Masanobu Fukuoka believed food and medicine were never truly separate. When you raise chickens in a way that follows natural law, the birds respond with stronger health, and what they give back to you carries that same vitality. Which brings us to the question every viewer is probably asking by now. How do you begin doing this in an ordinary backyard? Part 8. Reclaiming your sovereignty. How to start today. Now maybe you are thinking, this all sounds incredible, but I do not live on a Japanese farm. I have a small yard, maybe a side garden, maybe just a few raised beds and a modest flock. And that is exactly why this matters. Because you do not need acres of land to apply these ideas. You just need to understand the design behind them. The first place to begin is with a simple fermentation bucket. Take a basic 5-gallon container and start collecting usable kitchen scraps, vegetable peelings, fruit cores, stale bread, and similar leftovers. Add roughly the same volume of bran, whether that is rice bran, wheat bran, or oat bran. Then add enough water to create a thick, wet mash. Cover it loosely and let it sit for 3 to 7 days. Once it develops that clean, sour smell, you have a living feed your flock can actually benefit from. The second step is to grow food that brings food. Plant insect-attracting species like comfrey, amaranth, and sunflowers around the coop, along the garden edge, or even in large containers if space is tight. These plants do more than grow leaves. They pull insects into the system, create greens, produce seed, and give your chickens something to harvest for themselves. The third step is to stop keeping birds trapped in one tired, dusty run if you have any way to rotate them. Use simple, movable fencing and let the flock into harvested beds for a short period. Give them time to scratch, hunt, clean up leftovers, drop manure, and help prepare the ground for what comes next. When you start moving chickens through the space instead of keeping them locked away from it, the whole garden begins to function differently. And that is how real independence starts. Not all at once, and not with some giant expensive upgrade. It starts with one bucket, one planting, one small change in design. Add even one of these pieces and your feed bill can begin to drop. Put all three together, and you are no longer just keeping chickens. You are building a system that feeds itself better with every season. Conclusion: the one straw revolution in your backyard. For a long time, people have been told that farming has to be expensive, complicated, and dependent on purchased inputs. We have been taught to mistake dependence for efficiency. We stack bags of feed in the shed and call that security, even though the whole system still depends on stores, transport, pricing, and supply chains we do not control. But the farmers of post-war Japan showed something very different. So did thinkers like Fukuoka. They showed that resilience does not come from what you can keep buying. It comes from what you can connect. A system that turns waste into fertility, fertility into forage, forage into eggs, and manure back into soil will always be stronger than a system that survives only as long as the next bag arrives. That is the real lesson here. The strongest farm system is not the one with the most purchased products. It is the one where every part supports the next. The flock feeds the garden feeds the flock. The microbes support the birds support the soil. And slowly what looked like separate chores becomes one working ecosystem. Fukuoka once said that a revolution could begin with a single straw. And he was right. Because this kind of change does not begin with giant machinery or huge investments. It begins in ordinary places, with ordinary people, making better use of what is already around them. A bucket of scraps, a few seeds in the ground, a small flock. A willingness to stop forcing nature and start learning from it. So the real question is not whether this system works. The real question is whether you are ready to build it where you are. If this video changed the way you think about your flock, hit the like button, share it with another chicken keeper, and subscribe to Farmyard Care for more practical lessons drawn from the forgotten wisdom of natural farming. And down in the comments, tell me which step you would try first: the fermentation bucket, the insect plants, or rotational foraging. Until next time, keep observing, keep growing, and let nature lead the way.